Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I am Blake Fisher, and I'm a political junkie, so you don't necessarily have to be. Thank you for spending some of your valuable time with me today. And my guest, David Beckemeyer. David hosts the Outrage Overload podcast, which you can probably guess is about our current media and political landscape, a so-called outrage industry. They are manufacturing sort of outrage because it unfortunately works. So, David, thanks for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Blake. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So I wanted to talk about one specific topic because it just felt like a good jumping off point, because some of this outrage machine stuff is nonsense. It's going to be outrage today, and then tomorrow the 24-hour news cycle, it disappears. And that's, I try not to pay attention to that stuff. But there is some of the stuff that they manufacture that I think is more dangerous and more worthy of us being outraged ourselves about, being outraged about the outrage. I know that sounds kind of like a weird snake eating its own tail thing, but this would be what I'm specifically talking about. Is this last week we had the MAGA media world kind of jump all in on this narrative that the Justice Department was going to assassinate Donald Trump in the raid of Mar-a-Lago. It started with this tweet from Julie Kelly that was just citing this operation kind of thing for the search got released in the pretrial stuff for Trump. And she's basically saying, look, the FBI authorized the use of deadly force at Mar-a-Lago. And then, of course, it get picked up by the House Judiciary Committee, who has since deleted this tweet. I think they realized it was a bad look that they retweeted her thing, highlighting that law enforcement officers of the Department of Justice may use deadly force when necessary, which this is something that's in every warrant. It's in every operating thing. This is a normal thing. It was in Biden's search too. But then it gets picked up by Marjorie Taylor Greene, and then it gets picked up by Jim Banks, and it gets picked up by Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, who Ted Cruz I know is smart enough. Some of these other people, MTG, I'm not quite sure she's bright enough to actually know what she's doing. But Ted Cruz, he's a lawyer from Harvard. I believe that he actually knows the law well enough to know that this is standard stuff. And yet he's saying, that Merrick Garland personally approved deadly force at Mar-a-Lago, which is not true. And then Paul Gosar, of course, goes even further by saying Biden ordered the hit on Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Not true at all. And then by the end of the day, this is like a one-day news cycle, Donald Trump is using it for fundraising. He's saying the Biden DOJ was authorized to shoot me. They obviously, this is not true. The Biden Justice Department and the FBI specifically made sure that Trump wasn't there. They worked with I said Social Security, with Secret Service. That's a different agency, Secret Service, to make sure that they were coordinating. Obviously, you don't want two law enforcement things getting. They didn't want to knock down doors. They wanted to make sure they weren't home. So they did everything they could to make sure this was above board. Not that the FBI is not without fault in some sort of things, but this is just where I wanted to start off by saying this would be something and an example of them making up something based on a lie and then running with it to a degree that turns ordinary Americans mad enough to the point that they think that it's dangerous, that Joe Biden is trying to assassinate the person that they want to be president. How do we even start combating this when it comes to normal citizens that feel like this is an escalation, when our leaders, like the people that have been elected, this isn't just some crackpot on Twitter. There's plenty of conspiracy theorists now that the internet has given them Reddit and Twitter and all these places that they can spew their stuff. But it's a little different when it's coming from the guy that might be president in a few months.
Yeah, I mean, this is not exactly new. I mean, people have been spinning things for a long time, and but yeah, I think there's an escalation here that we're not used to, especially like you say, when the actual candidates and elected officials start jumping on some of these more, I don't know, outlandish ideas, right? That take the worst possible spin on something and exaggerate it. Like, could you say it's an outright lie? Maybe, maybe not, but it's absolutely, leaving a lot of detail out,
Yes.
to say that. And it's certainly saying it was a hit. I mean, that's clearly a
Yeah.
lie, right?
That's
That's
an elected representative that's in Congress that said Biden ordered the hit on. I mean, some of the other stuff you can tell. I think that now that we've seen Fox News have their defamation thing and stuff, I think some people have wised up to the fact that they actually can be potentially sued for libel in some of these situations. There's a free speech thing, but there is a certain point that you can cross where someone could be like, actually, that's so untrue and so an attack on a character, and you knew it was untrue, that you can. So, most of them hedged on that. You can tell some of them are like, Biden ordered this. Merrick Garland ordered the justification of using weapons. It's like, yeah, that's technically true, because he does that on every warrant that they search. This language is in there. So it's technically true he approved it, but he didn't specifically approve it because it was Donald Trump. So that's a hard thing to combat, right?
Well, yeah, and and also, the politicians are sort of excluded from that, right? Because we have our First Amendment rights very powerful about what we can say about a politician, even if it's not true, right? It's very hard to
It is.
convict anybody
Yeah.
for a libel there or anything, right? So you can say almost anything about about a politician. So to say Joe Biden did the thing is like almost nothing's going to happen. But a big change is when there was something that outrageously kind of just incorrect and kind of outrageous in general. The public used to call that out a lot more, right? Like you
Yeah.
really wouldn't get away with that very much, right? But that was pretty hard for an actual elected official to say something that outlandish and not have you know a reasonable amount of pushback from their own side.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing that you don't see anymore, right? Because we've gotten into this mode where we want this sort of validation. There's one thing that Trump, I think, tapped into really well is this idea that people were hungry for somebody that was fighting for them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people are seeing in this kind of stuff is that there's somebody out there fighting for me because I'm mad. I mean, look, I get it. Like a lot of people are mad. Like, and some of that's our own doing. Like
Yeah.
we often overlook a lot of the good things going on, or like we talk about fascism. It's like, oh, you should probably see what real fascism
Right.
looks like, stuff like that, right? But so some of that's brought on ourselves, but at the same time, there are people are legitimately hurting. Like people are suffering. Things aren't great for everybody. And so you can see why people get mad and people get frustrated, and so then they feel like nobody's speaking for them, and I think that's what a lot of this is about too, right? That people they know that there's an audience for that. Like you're gonna sort of stand for me. You're gonna really fight for me, and I think that we're not doing a good job to count make these politicians accountable to not doing that to that degree. Like, and it's because we kind of want it. Like we like this idea that somebody's out there fighting for us, and this is the danger of this is that the people that this is one danger I'm really concerned about these kinds of things is that, like kind of the folks that ultimately were willing to go do what they did on January 6th, it's because they believed the election was being taken away, was rigged or whatever, right? And they believe it wasn't fair, and their candidate, their person that won was taken away. In this case, now you're telling them not only did the votes get taken away, now you're telling them the candidate themselves is going to be taken away. And so not only going to steal the election, they're going to steal our candidate, like literally. And so it's sad that there's a audience for that's ready to buy into that and not sort of step back for one moment and go, does that really sound like it makes sense? Like you were saying, if you really look at these facts, like the FBI and even Merrick Garland, he didn't want to have anything to do with. He wished he could never had to
Oh
arrest Trump for
gosh.
this, right?
He wanted to hide under a rock during this whole thing, right? I mean, like I'm sure.
He was giving him so many chances to give those documents back and just let it go, right? Like every chance. He didn't want to have anything to do with this. And Trump, I think, intentionally pushed it because he knew he could make a fundraising effort out of it.
I think you're right.
Sorry about that.
That's
Sorry
fine.
about the dog barking. And so why they do it is the same reason that media does it. I mean, everybody is sort of in this to it's easier to campaign and win campaigns if you can, sort of make if you can boil everything down to this argument that the other side is sort of evil and terrible, and I don't have to really talk about issues or address any of the sort of nuance in the reality of a lot of these things. We can just sort of say we're good, they're bad, and Democrats and Republicans both use that strategy, and this is kind of a extreme a case of it where they're willing to and we've seen this escalate where people are willing to take these things farther and farther, right? And to yeah, I think right now the right is more guilty of sort of jumping on some of these more outlandish things. And that might be a cycle. I would not put it past Democrats doing the same kind of thing if they found themselves in a situation where they thought it was warranted. And you do see that kind of thing to that, where a story really is something that if you keep drilling down, you go, well, like you say, it's practically a boilerplate thing when you really finally get to the bottom of this,
Right.
right? And you see that kind of thing with Democrats too. But they'll spin it. The Democratic narrative will be a spin that makes it sound like Trump said he's going to do X, Y, Z,
Yeah.
and so, this is a somewhat standard tactic, but yeah, I mean, it is, so you can see why they do it, right? They do it to fit that narrative that we're good, they're bad, and just take any nuance out of that reality. And it's a shame that we're to that point because we want it, right? I mean, that's what we like it. Like we want to be told how terrible the other side is,
Yeah, and I think
and it
it's
helps.
yeah, the negative polarization is obviously, I think, the biggest contributing factor to politics right now is that most people are not voting for a side, they're voting against another side. And so naturally, Trump would rather talk about Biden and trying to make him seem as bad as potentially he is, because he's actually campaigning on this kind of behavior. Actually, I mean, he's calling it retribution, And I think to me, it seems like in this specific case, it's not just to create outrage and fundraising. To me, it's trying to give a permission structure that, like, well, look, they tried to assassinate me and they tried to weaponize the Justice Department, or they try, even though these things are normally, like in this case, this is absolutely a nothing burger. This is absolutely not true. There is nothing here that is not standard. There's nothing. I mean, the FBI went out of their way specifically to not even be dressed normal. They didn't have the helicopters. They worked with Secret Service. They made sure they did it when Trump wasn't even at Mar-a-Lago. They went like way out of their way, probably because honestly, the FBI really didn't want to get in the crosshairs of this. FBI has done some not great things over the last couple decades. I think that are really longer than that. There's a lot of things I'd like to change about the FBI and the way they function, but I'm sure they didn't want to be in the middle of this. Biden's DOJ doing a search warrant on a previous president. This never happened before. Sure, they just didn't want no part of it, especially with someone that they knew was going to try to turn this into this kind of narrative. So they went out of their way to not do that. And I think to the disappointment of Trump and the kind of MAGA media world, because they got to kind of say it was a raid, but it didn't look like a raid when it's a bunch of guys in khakis. They didn't even have the FBI jackets. Of course they're armed. FBI agents are armed all the time. If you're on a plane with an FBI agent, even if he's going to Disney World with his family, he's got to be armed on that plane. That's just, you're on duty kind of thing. So it's interesting because I feel like it's just trying to make excuses for future bad behavior from their side, because now that's the other thing that we're doing is we're saying, well, because the other side did something bad, we've got to do something worse to prevent them from doing bad things. It's a weird cycle, and I don't know, it's weird to be outraged about the outrage, in the sense that, like, what makes me mad is that they're using this as a tool for those ends. And I don't know I don't know how you check against this though. Like, do you have any great ideas for how the average, I mean, or even us, because the truth is no one that listens to the crowd that is spewing this information is going to listen to someone like me or you probably tell them that it's wrong, right?
Right. Right, there's a little bit of the if you're already to the point where you're listening to your show or my show, you're probably, sort of halfway there already, right? Um, and you're probably not as likely to kind of fall into this kind of stuff. And we still do it. We all do it. I mean, even I do it. Like we all do it. I've been studying this stuff for a long time and I do it, right? So we all
Yeah, of
do it.
course.
But we're going to be less likely to really go down that rabbit hole hardcore and that kind of thing. But so I think that's true of our audiences as well, compared to, sort of, a lot of average folks that are out there really angry. And I think, you know, it's it's as you were saying, when we were kind of talking about this before, these kinds of things are really dangerous because it never ends well for the people that kind of get sucked into it, right? I mean, they're the I mean, there's one vicious cycle you kind of talked about, which is like we vote against somebody, and then we're mad when we don't vote for someone. Then we're kind of mad when they don't do anything, right? Or they can't do anything because they don't really understand. Oftentimes, we kind of don't really understand how our own government system works. That it's
Yeah, I
really
mean,
hard to do things,
the stats on that
And so
are
then we're
really
mad.
interesting. Yeah, because most people don't understand, can't name the three branches of the government, don't understand how laws are created, think the president can just do everything he promises he's going to do. It's interesting.
Right. So there's that kind of vicious cycle that kind of has stirred a lot of this up, that we just get madder every time. Even when our side wins, we don't get what we want. So we get madder. So there's that kind of going on. But yeah, you're right that there's this big piece about this moving our moral bar too, right? So it's every time they do something that, if draws, it crosses our line, then we'll kind of say, well, then next time we'll do it, right? Or maybe we better do it before they do it, and
Yeah.
that's a trend that's, I think, really increased a lot over the past 20 years, and maybe even a lot more over the past 10. But you've seen this happening. I mean, I think one example you might think about with people on the left would be one time, at one point they probably would have said, well, if something came up and we were able to sort of do something a little underhanded to get a Supreme Court seat, we're not going to do that because it's not really right. But now that they feel like they've had a couple taken away from them, the next time they have an opportunity to take a seat, they're taking a seat no matter what. Anything that's legal is going to
Yeah.
be fair game, right? There's not going to be any of that. Well, that's not really the correct way to be, and
Yeah.
that's done with. Like they're past that, so they have moved. You could argue that the Democratic side has moved that moral bar. Like there's no moral bar now. It's either legal or not legal, or they're going to push that right to the edge now next time, and their base would want them to do that as well. So it's not just changing at the elite level, but it's changing within the base too, and even beyond the base. I mean, it's kind of like it's become a feeling like you've been you, you know you've been somehow they've broken some really important moral value for you, and you feel like these things start to become justified. And that one of the things, Danigal G. Young, who has written several books about this, but she kind of has a sort of rhetorical sort of trick that she talks about, of these sort of three C's that we find ourselves at. We need comprehension, control, and community, right? So the idea here is we want to understand the world, and we also need some feeling of control, and we also need that community. So these kind of things achieve those goals, right? And you asked previously when we were having a little preview exchange, like, do they believe it? Do they not believe it? And there's two different issues there. I think there's definitely, when you look at like the Stop the Steal thing and all that, there's definitely a lot of people that really do believe, to some degree. Like, it's probably not a black and white thing, but
Yeah.
they believe, one way or the other, that believe more that there's something. And I think with this, it's the same way. People probably believe to some degree. Maybe they don't full on believe like there was a hit plan and they were going to go, but they believe, yeah, I could see the FBI doing this kind of bad thing. Um, and so there's that I think there are, and those are the people that I think are the victims in this, right? Because they're the ones who end up, kind of getting arrested on January 6th, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to be freaking, Ted Cruz, out there getting arrested. It's going to be these poor people that fall into it.
Yeah, because
And
they're
so this
essentially
is why it's
duped.
really dangerous.
Yeah, they're duped into this. They're like, I really think that for the most part, I understand. Like, for example, I think that you used to be able to pay attention to a news organization and the leaders in a party, and you could probably get an idea. I mean, you're right. There's always been spin. Spin is a thing, like no doubt about it. But now that we have cable news channels and newspapers and online sites, and basically everyone has decided we're not going to actually have a discussion about the issues, and we're not going to fight amongst ourselves. There's this new like be loyal to the party kind of thing, or be loyal to Donald Trump, or be loyal to Joe Biden, even if what he's doing is you absolutely disagree with. I mean, I realize at the fringes that's not necessarily happening. The kind of squad on the left is, and there's a lot of anti-Biden kind of stuff on the far left. Just like I think there's a decent amount of anti-Trump stuff on the right. It's not from the fringes. It's actually towards the independents where that's coming from. The people that are still voting 21% in Indiana for Nikki Haley in a primary are obviously, when she's long gone out of the race, obviously there's some sort of protest vote there that's saying, I don't like this guy. So I think there's, a rough percentage of the population that's like that. But I don't blame people for thinking they should be able to believe what comes out of the mouths of not just one senator or one congressperson, but like multiple of them that are saying that this happened and that Joe Biden's Justice Department was authorizing to assassinate Donald Trump. It sounds crazy, but I also understand why people would believe these people, because it sucks that we can't believe them anymore. I mean, there's always been this thing about politicians lying, but most people put that in a spin of, well, politicians lie to get elected, so they say things they don't mean sometimes, or they promise things they know they can't deliver, or they try to cover up their mistakes. That we're going through a whole trial right now in New York about Donald Trump trying to cover up his affair, and paying money for it and stuff. And that's a normal part of political operations. I don't think we even understand how much they're just actually making stuff up now because they don't have anything better to talk about. And I do feel bad for the January 6th people that get arrested. It doesn't excuse their behavior in any way, but they were duped. I think that if I thought an election was actually being stolen, I might do the same thing because we, especially on the right, with sort of the Second Amendment crowd, and like, hey, like, our not even just Second Amendment, it's just normally they go hand in hand, but the sort of like the whole purpose of the Revolutionary War was that we didn't want to be ruled by a tyrant anymore, and so we fought back. And we thought that we have the right to fight back against it. It's like enshrined in the Constitution, basically. It's the Federalist Papers and all these things of the people should hold the government accountable when the government stops doing the things they're supposed to do or is like treading on the rights of people. These people on January 6th thought that. Now they were wrong, but they're kind of victims. It's just weird. I don't feel a lot of sympathy for them because it's not hard to get on the internet and find out what's true and what's not. But I do understand why people go, well, who am I supposed to believe? This person says A is happening. The other person says the exact opposite of A is happening. And where's anyone that's actually going to give me the facts? How do you think we get out of this? If it's possible at all.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things have kind of conspired to find us in the situation we're in, right? Like we all all kind of want to find, the it was, the media with a candlestick and the library kind of answer, right? That there's some one culprit to all this, and if we just go after them, we can fix it all. And
Yeah,
and
you're
it's,
right.
it's there. And it's a lot more complicated than that, of course. And but and so it's been kind of a buildup of all these things, and so it's been a negative spiral. We talked about a few of the examples of those kinds of negative spirals, and so the the way to do it, really get there, is to kind of turn that around and somehow start these upward spirals, right? Start spiraling this in the other direction, and a lot of that does start with us, and it starts with you know community and um, paying becoming a little bit more introspective,
Yeah.
and doing some of the things you're saying, like, when you see these stories and they're kind of like they really have this, wow, that's terrible, but then instead of just going, wow, that's terrible, and tweeting about it and retweeting it, and then you can probably go, wait, I should probably look into that. Like, is that really right? Did that really happen? Like, is that how it went down? And what is that, and no, that's a little bit hard to do, right? Because and I talk to some of the, like, there's a second, it's not only is it hard to do because it's sometimes hard to check yourself, or it's always hard to check yourself, but there's also, like, well, there's no incentive for it. Like, why would I do that? Like,
You're
there's
right.
no reason for me to do that, right? So we've got to start accepting that reason. Oh, that reason is because this kind of stuff is gonna destroy the country, is destroying the country, right? And and we want to, there's this idea of that's how we get to this point of believing, well, we'll just have a national divorce. Well, that's not a thing. Like, that's how, like,
That's
you
a
can't
civil
do that.
war. You
Like, it's not
can't do
gonna,
that. Yeah.
you can't do that, right? Even a civil war doesn't achieve that. You're just
Right.
gonna, at the end of the civil war, you're gonna be in the exact same
Yeah.
situation. Like, what did we achieve? Nothing. A bunch of people died, and we're back in the exact same situation. So there's no such thing as the divorce answer. Divorce answer is not a real thing.
It's
So
not.
we're gonna live together, and it's our country together, and and we want a lot of the same things. We often just get, because of the spin and everything else, we often feel like there's a lot less of that overlap, and we believe, once we get to the point where we think half the country is stupid or racist or a woke sheep, or once we're to that point, like, you can't get anywhere from there, right? If you really believe half the country, like you were talking about, the victims, and why, like, if we believe these narratives, and if we believe the election was stolen, yeah, like, we can see why we'd want to do something, like maybe storm the Capitol is not the right thing, but something, you can see that kind of thing being something you believe in. I mean, I think when you believe the narratives that we're telling ourselves, if you believe that Trump's the last election we'll ever have, if you believe, that MAGA is going to destroy democracy and blah blah blah, yeah, why wouldn't you? A little violence, that seems like a reasonable thing. Why, like, it'd be dumb not to, right? So sometimes when we ask why is there violence, we should actually be asking, like, why hasn't there been more violence if we believe these narratives we're telling each other?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because really Biden and Trump are both trying to make this election in 2024 a referendum on the other person. It's just a really weird situation in the fact that we have two people that have already been president. And so it's kind of, they're both incumbents. We've only had this happen one other time before, and it was in the 1800s. So it's been a long time. We didn't have social media. We didn't have any kind of the media landscape that we have now. And so it's so interesting that you're right. They're trying to say both sides right now, and this is not like a both sides them in the sense that I'm always trying to find something wrong. They are literally both saying it's going to be the end of democracy if you vote for that guy. Biden's saying about Donald Trump, and I don't think there's. It's not that I don't think there's a there because Donald Trump is broadcasting his authoritarian tendencies, and he has already done so after the last election we saw with the stop the steal stuff that wasn't real. And so Biden's not wrong about it, and Donald Trump's doing the same thing with Joe Biden. And I don't necessarily think that he's wrong in a different way, because I think that, my sort of logical thing is not that like Biden's going to like be some authoritarian, but the MAGA side is coming from the side of like these policies are going to ruin America. And, I can see why people reasonably believe both, but that's a really bad spot to be in when it's like I don't believe the Flight 93 election stuff. I think that we hyped that kind of like this is, every election is the most important election of your life. It's weird how that keeps happening over and over and over again. And then we keep escalating like what the stakes are for that election. So not only is it the most important, but democracy will end if you vote for the wrong person. That hasn't happened yet. I mean, I certainly January 6th was shocking, but it nowhere near succeeded. It just didn't. It didn't succeed. Now I think that bad things could have happened and bad things did happen, but it didn't succeed. I don't think Trump's I don't buy into the Trump. I don't think he's apt enough to be able to do it if he wanted to end America. I mean, I don't think he has the policy. I hope the institutions would hold, but we do get in this weird thing where most people are going like, well, I'm scared for the end of the world, or I'm scared for the end. And to me, we're doing that with policies too. The left is doing that with climate change. They're saying, I mean, for my entire life, they've been saying the world's going to end in 12 years. Like it's going to be an uninhabitable planet based on no science whatsoever. But they go to the extreme instead of just saying, like, look, here's the real data. Here's what the IEEE says about what might happen if we don't do something about global warming. They don't say that because that doesn't get enough headlines. And so the problem is like everyone thinks the world's going to end. And I don't know how that goes back into the bottle without actually something very bad happening. Is that too fearful on my part?
Well, I'm concerned that the very bad would have to be so very bad it would be like Venezuela, and really you're talking about like you don't recover from that, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's what I'm worried about. If it's going to take that, so I'm hoping that we can begin to getting back to your question earlier about how do we get out of this. I think a big one is beginning to accept that the um, this mode that we're in is not going to end well. And whether it's Trump this time that maybe finally crosses that line, or whether it's some future president in a few election cycles that does, that's where we're headed. That's kind of where we're headed. We're headed to, some really big, you know, problems. And I think it's kind of funny though to what you were just saying about how we catastrophize and how it's always been the worst election ever, that kind of thing. Like I hear, and I know the world's a lot different than when I was there, and I had a different set of privileges and things like that. But I've heard that's the idea that Social Security wasn't going to be there since I was a teenager, right?
Right.
So that's not a new story. Like you hear Gen Z talking about Social Security is going to die and I'll never get it. Well, we were saying the same things when I was a teenager. So
Yeah.
that's not a new story either. A lot of this stuff is like we think this has never happened before. And if you just take an example of, you could say it for Trump and for Biden, that but certainly if you look at the list of things that were going to happen and reason why January 6th was so important, and like we were saying before, like, yeah, if I believe these narratives, why I would think about violence probably, right? I mean, if you talk to the people that were there, which I have interviews from people, from Gonzo journalists that were there talking to the real people. This is not the narrative spin that either the January 6th committee did or the narrative spin of news, any news organization. This is just real people saying these things. and they rattle off the things that they were concerned about. Biden by now should have taken the guns. Biden by now should have. I can't even remember all the lists, but
Right.
none of those things happened.
Right.
Not a single one. Right? Biden's been president for 4 years. Right?
Yeah.
None of those things happened, and and you could say that sort of the same thing, although it wasn't exactly the same kind of list of things that people were saying in 2016 that they're saying in 2024.
Right.
But you could say the same thing about Trump. Like, yeah, a bunch of stuff that people didn't like, but let's go back a little bit. What really happened? Like, is the list really as bad as? So the fact that we can't even remember that, like we said by now, Biden should have already done all those things, and the
Right.
world should be over. And it didn't happen. But we're ready to say it. We're saying it again. It's gonna this time for sure. It's gonna happen for sure this time. So nothing old is new. I mean, nothing new. It's like,
And what's so interesting about, you brought up Social Security. That's a great example of something that like is a real problem in the sense that, it'll go insolvent. People's benefits are either going to get cut to 75%, I think it's 2033, or we're going to have to raise more money for it. We got to raise taxes or benefits are going to get cut. That's like a deadline that's actually in the sand. And while we have been talking about it for a long time,
well, and we've had deadlines like that in the past. That
well,
that kind of thing has come up a bunch of times
but not
where
this,
it's
not
gonna
the
get cut on
insolvency
this
thing.
date.
I don't
Well,
feel like
not quite.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it has. I'm telling you, I definitely could find news
Well,
stories
I remember news
and
stories, but they always pointed to the 2030s. But the problem is we're now actually getting close to the
right,
2030s,
right,
and so what's funny about that is like that is an actual issue that we need to at least talk about.
right.
Like that's part of the reason we're in so much debt. Like if we care about the debt, entitlements are absolutely the thing driving the $33 trillion debt. Not that there wasn't a lot of spending by Trump and a lot of spending by Biden, but what's so interesting to me is like has the potential to actually be a real crisis. Like the debt is a real potential crisis. Like you talk about the Venezuela situation, neither one of them are touching that issue that might actually be catastrophic. And instead, they're catastrophizing things that aren't probably ever going to happen. And they're making stuff up, like that Biden's trying to assassinate Donald Trump during a Mar-a-Lago raid. So it's interesting that neither one of them will touch Social Security. They've just both said, like, we're not even going to, like, I bet that question doesn't come up at the debate. If it does come up at the debate, they're going to dodge it. And they're going to say, or not even dodge it. They're just going to say, I will not touch anything about Social Security. And even if they're faced with like, well, but what are we going to do about the insolvency and like benefits potentially being cut or taxes being raised? Like someone's going to have to do that in a few years. They're just going to punt because they're not going to be president then. They might not even be
They don't want to
alive
be
then.
no, they don't want to be in the hot seat when that happens. No.
Yeah.
Well, but this gets back to what we were saying at the beginning, right? Like, no, they don't want to talk about any issue like that because it's much easier if all I have to do is tell you how bad the other guy is. If I could just keep making all the elections about how terrible the other person is, then I don't have to deal with these actual real things that could be a problem. And I always love one of my favorite sort of quotes about things like the debt are, the debt's not a problem until it is, right? So,
Yeah.
because we've had debt forever and people go, it's not a problem because
Right.
look, Reagan, blah, blah, blah. And then we can just fix it with more debt and more debt. It's like, but the classic economist line is it's not a problem until it is. At some point,
I think
it is going to catch up.
I think it was Milton Friedman or something that said like you go bankrupt little by little and then all at once or something, because it's like
Right.
that's kind of how these kind of crises come about. It's not a slow turn of the faucet. Normally it's like it's a buildup that then there's this crisis that explodes. And so it seems like there's plenty of things that are worth. I think that's what's most interesting to me. I think there's a lot of things that are worth being outraged about that are not getting any traction in any of the media, even though I think that they are real problems that need real solutions. And like the one that I've been harping on for, I mean, there's a lot of them. I mean, I think the debt is one of those things. I think that obviously like medical everything is a nightmare and everyone knows it is. And I know there's no easy solutions, but no one's even really going like, let's actually talk about what the problems are so that we can figure out what the solutions are. Because if a problem doesn't have a solution, it's not a problem. Then it's just a fact. It's just a thing that can't be solved. If it can't be solved, it's not a problem. I mean, I've been talking a lot about the the Department of Education. This is like a 20-year-old study now, but obviously there's plenty of stuff in the news about it, about how like sexual abuse of minors by teachers. These are like really bad. This is happening at a large scale that it shouldn't be happening at. And yet I feel like we should be seeing stuff on the news all the time about that, because why wouldn't everyone be outraged by that? No one wants kids to be sexually abused by teachers. That seems like a bad idea. Let's weed out the ones that are doing that, make sure it's not possible to continue doing. So I feel like there's all these issues that I think are worth people's outrage, and it would be so I wonder, do you have a good theory on why people don't go after those stories that would legitimately cause outrage? So it's gonna get you your eyeballs, it's gonna get you your clicks or whatever, but are actually things that are worth being outraged about? Is just doesn't seem like those things get talked about as much by politicians or news media.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. No, I don't actually have too much of a theory on that. I'll have to think about that a little bit more because, yeah, like you say, in some sense, many of these things probably well, they'd certainly have the outrage, but whether or not they sort of fit the overall narrative of a nice, clean, simple bad guy, good guy,
I think that's
like
probably what it is. I think you're right. It's not as black and white as it is, and it is complicated because right now you're right. The outrage thing is right now is like Joe Biden did bad thing. Get rid of Joe Biden. It's a simple two-step process. That's basically what everyone wants everyone to believe is like, and really like the right has done this. Who used to be limited government are now not really talking about that at all. They're just like, we think we'd be better at running the bureaucracy. It's not that they're trying to get rid of the
right?
bureaucracy. They're just trying to replace
No,
it with their own. And it's so funny to me that they're like, oh well, the bureaucracy is bad because of the people that are in it. But if we put our people in it, it'll work great. And there's just no evidence that that's going to happen. And I think that's why we get this swing. That's why you used to have these, longer periods of time where a party might be in power and then they maybe slowly lose it or they do something enough to piss off enough people. And then you'd see this, kind of red wave or blue wave. And that is basically happening every 2 years now. I mean, over since 2016, you've had this jump back and forth between, Democrats, Republicans controlling stuff. And a lot of times it almost seems like people are wanting divided government 2 years into every presidency now. Like they're literally always going, nope. We gave you 2 years of you having the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and you squandered it. You did absolutely nothing that we liked with it, and so we're going to vote in some other people that can prevent you from doing that, which ends up with gridlock. So I don't see you talked about the divided, like the divorce. I think that's unrealistic too. I think it's just not a thing that can happen. But I do wonder if dysfunction at the federal level continues at the pace that it has been. Does that open up for more federalism of states, which you're kind of seeing some of that now, where states are just kind of going like, we're going to do our own thing. And we don't think that, you saw this with marijuana laws in some states where they kind of said, yeah, we know it's federally illegal, but we don't care. We don't really think the DEA is going to come in here and start, enforcing this law. They don't have the resources to do it. You see it with sanctuary cities in some regard with immigration. You've seen it with the right, with certain sheriff's offices or states saying, we're not going to enforce federal gun laws that we don't think are just. So you're starting to see this happen at a state by state level. Do you think that's a future where we just end up back to like every state has their own little weird quirky thing because the federal government can't accomplish anything? I mean, I know that that's a nice little neat bow on it that's not going to go that well, but
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that the federal government's not going to accomplish anything. You say that like it's a bad thing, but I
oh,
mean,
I don't know if it is. Yeah,
that's kind of how the framers built the country, right? I mean, the
I
whole
agree.
idea was that the federal system was supposed to be pretty difficult to get much done, and as you say, sort of delegate a lot of it to the states for a lot of these details, right? And so to some degree, part of this is what we were saying before about there's some civics education that needs to happen, and we need to understand a little bit better what to expect from the federal government, and some of that, again, I said like there's never like the one place you can point, but a piece of that is also the fact that we don't have local journalism anymore. So we've gone to this national news media. So what do they focus on? They focus on these national issues. They focus on national elections because that's that's they're on everyone's TV, right? They're not only in my town.
Yeah.
So we lose sight. We expect a lot more out of the national politics than is realistic. Like, we should not be surprised that people get elected and then not that much happens. Like that's kind of how it's supposed to work.
Right. And I
So,
I think that's been missing though because those politicians promised the moon. And you
right,
you had
right.
you had a segment on your episode about overpromising and just how so talk a little bit about that. I mean, how much you think overpromising is leading to the disappointment that leads to these swings back and forth.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's a big piece of what how you end up with people that I think January 6th is an extreme example of that, but it's how you end up with people being really frustrated and angry all the time and directing it at the national level, um, expecting more. And that's not exactly new, but I think that's gotten a lot worse since we've lost local journalism because we expect these national politicians, 2,000 miles away working in Washington, D.C., can somehow fix the potholes in our streets. It's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's created this, yeah, a big dissatisfaction. And the media, the partisan media is a factor of that as well, right? And like you say, the partisan media then is also echoed by the politicians themselves. They echo that same story, how the other side is bad. We're good. We're going to fix these things when we just give us the House and we'll fix all these things. And even when you have majorities these days, it's still difficult. There are a lot of things at the federal level in the political system that make it hard. I mean, and again, you get back to these questions of democracy. Oh, we'll get rid of well, gerrymandering, thing like that might be a good thing, but we're going to get rid of the I'm sorry, I'm losing the
Filibuster.
word filibuster.
Yeah.
We're going to get rid of the filibuster. Well, that's not necessarily a good democratic move either. So yeah, that's been a big problem that we some of it is that we just expect way too much, and yeah, and the politicians and the news media, I think, have created that to a large degree where they just keep telling us all the bad things the other side has done. So by the time one of these election cycles comes up, as you say, we're ready to throw them out. And I think it's what's the biblical thing? I cast on both houses,
Oh yeah.
kind of thing, right?
Yeah. And I think that some of that is this is my unpopular opinion. And when I say unpopular, it gets I feel like it gets a pushback from almost everyone I say it to, but I think that everything boils down to voters. I mean, really, it boils down to the American citizens. It's like when we're not, especially in an age when we have access to all the information available essentially. I mean, it takes some work, yes, and I don't feel like politics and paying attention to it should have to be a full-time job. I don't like that I'm a political junkie. I've always enjoyed this stuff, but I don't feel like everyone should have to be. I don't think that you should have to pay attention for all 4 years. That's the reason we have the kind of government we have is so that you can elect someone that you trust to go pay attention to everything and make some good decisions based on that. I'm more of the kind of guy that believes that representatives are not just supposed to represent what I think. I think they're supposed to go be more knowledgeable than me. I think that they're supposed to be on the committees they're on and pay attention to the details and make a good decision. And I might not even understand that decision. You don't have to explain everything to me. Like, I think that's how this government was supposed to work. But it's turned into the opposite. I feel like more people now feel like, no, the representative's supposed to do exactly what I tell them to all the time. And then I'm really uninformed about how that works, but I'm still going to yell and scream about what I want you to do. Or I'm going to, normally it's not that Democrats are beating Republicans or that Republicans are beating Democrats and kicking people out of Congress. They're getting primaried by someone further to the extreme in their party. That's how, we're not seeing a lot of like red things flip blue and blue things flip red. Obviously, at the margins, there are some swing states. There are some seats that are less safe. Joe Manchin's West Virginia seat is probably going to go to Republicans because he was an anomaly being a Democrat that was popular in that state. But it's going to be hard for another Democrat to come in and get that and keep that seat. There are at the margins that, but if like Mike Gallagher in Wisconsin got primaried by a more MAGA Republican, it's not going that House seat is not flipping to the blue. And so I just wonder if I blame the voters in some degree. Now I do think that we are being lied to all the time. So it is hard to navigate that. But I still think like constitutionally it boils down to it's our responsibility to elect better representatives. And so but that makes it but like that's not a popular opinion because it's like if everyone did pay attention enough to where they didn't believe lies and they just looked into something to figure out if it was true or not, that would start changing elections, but people aren't willing to do that. Is that unfair?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack
Yeah,
there.
there's a lot,
Um,
sorry.
two threads that I'll pull on. One is kind of the people, how informed people are. So let's come to that in a second. So don't let me forget about that. But
Yeah.
I think the other thing that's become a challenge there is that, I think I mentioned this on the live QA that we did about, one definition of democracy is that people can lose elections,
Yeah.
and that's been decreasing a lot, right? I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but it used to be, something. There was a lot more competitive districts,
Yes.
and it's gone down significantly over the last 25 years. So that there's very few competitive districts now, and that's how you get these situations where everything's about the primaries because, like you said, the Republican can never lose or the Democrat can never lose. There's it's not, and I say never, but it's rarer, right? I mean, you used to see more switches of like what were the swing states, and you still see some of that, but that's become less, right? So
Yeah.
it can change. Like we can't be totally pessimistic here. It can change, but it often sort of these districts get pretty safe. Like you have where Boebert is, like she's totally disliked, but she's not going to lose.
She's not
Like
gonna
she's
lose.
just not going to lose.
Yeah.
She's not going to lose. I mean, it does happen. Like it does get bad enough that somebody lose, but like Mitch McConnell is like really horrible approval ratings. He's not going to lose.
Yeah.
Like there's no way he's going to lose. So that's a bit of a challenge that, and again, and in terms of your having an unpopular opinion, like one of the things I always say in the show, and I'm sure I know my listeners are tired of hearing about it, is like we've met the enemy and it's us, right?
Yeah. It
It's
is.
kind of the same thing.
Well, because like Lauren
And so
Boebert,
yeah,
you bring up is a good example of she is representing her constituencies correctly. That's what bothers me the most about it is that like they want that performative kind of nonsense. Like they've elected her multiple times now. And so you're it's but that's where I'm saying the blame lies with them. Like the takeover Trump's takeover of the Republican Party was, in 2016, you could say it was an anomaly of some sorts because he never had a majority. He had a plurality and there was some ticket splitting kind of going on between people saying, well, like the traditional sort of Republicans were like splitting their votes between Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and John Kasich or something. And then he was just getting this completely new thing. And he was winning primaries with 30, 40% of the vote. Well, that's not the case in 2024. Like we know him, we've seen what he does. We saw January 6th, we saw his nonsense about stopping the steal and that the election was stolen and it wasn't. And still in this Republican primary, Republicans chose him overwhelmingly. Now, like I said, there's a 20% of the Republican Party that I think is very anti-Trump, but that's only 20% of the party. So in some ways, I'm like, we are like we are getting exactly what people want, which is why I then blame the people for wanting the wrong thing. And that's unpopular because people are like, how dare you blame voters? But we are in charge here. I mean, they work for us and we're
right,
obviously
right.
not. Yeah.
For all the people that say our vote's not important, like, or your vote doesn't matter, like, then why are they spending so much money to care about it? Like, clearly your vote does matter, right? And so, I mean, we have to keep that in mind. Like you say, we do still have that power. I think we also have to be careful about putting all of our, sort of hopes and dreams on that one vote. Like, if you want to achieve things, there's other things you can do beyond that, right? I mean,
Oh, of
go ahead and
course.
take on that charge of activism to work locally, work in your community, go to your fire department meetings. I mean, there's a lot more you can do than vote. And so sometimes that feeling like my vote didn't get anything done, there are options besides just every 4 years voting or every 2 years voting, right? So if you really, pick it, and you can't care about everything either. Like, I mean, be
No.
realistic, have some self care. But if you do have some things you're passionate about, tweeting about them every day isn't going to get anything done. Get involved and do something better than that. It doesn't help you to tweet either. You might get a short jolt of some neurotransmitter, but it has no lasting effect. So it's not going to help you in the long run.
That is absolutely true. Is that I think that's what social media and the internet, I think that's the worst thing it's brought in is the thought that like, oh, I tweeted and therefore I did something. And we see this with every kind of big issue. Like Black Lives Matter was, I think, a legitimate issue, but the people thought that they could just change their Instagram picture to a solid black square and that was doing something about any kind of racial problems in the United States. To me is kind
Like,
of
I put
like,
a sign in my yard, man. What do you
yeah,
want?
right. It's like, oh, let's pat myself on the back. I did something. Look, I'm doing something. It's like, not really. I think the biggest problem that we have is that we a long time ago, and this is good. You brought this up. We had a great discussion after the premiere of your episode with, I can't remember, there was like 50 people there or something like that. And it was a really great discussion that was civil, and it was talking about, and had different opinions, and different people chimed in and had great questions. And that was like a legitimate discussion that I think is like sorely missing from most of the, like, there are podcasts obviously where people have discussions, but for the most part, even those have been kind of, here's your right one. And they might kind of argue, but it's more of just more bashing of the other side generally. And I think people aren't having these conversations in real life because we were told not to. It's like, oh, don't talk about politics or religion at the dinner table. And then we're shocked that people don't know how to talk about politics in a
Right.
civil way because they've not practiced it for their whole lives. And I don't know how we start that, but I do think it will take leadership. I think it's going to take a president that encourages those kind of conversations. One thing that the biggest podcaster in the world, Joe Rogan, gets a lot of crap for is they're like, well, you're spewing misinformation. And I do, like, he could do some basic research, but I think what people are attracted to with his show is that he's just having an honest, like real conversation, like you would in your living room with a friend potentially, where you don't know every answer and you're asking questions and stuff. And I think people are desperate for that, obviously, because I think it's missing in their own lives and they're trying to live vicariously through pick your podcast host kind of thing. But we could do better to actually have those conversations like you facilitated, which, so I appreciate that you did that, because it's probably a little scary, right? I mean, because now it's like, well, this is a live thing. We're taking questions from people. We're trying to make sure people are civil. And you even at one point kind of did shut down something. You're like, I don't want to get into that kind of, seems, that seems a little conspiratorial or whatever. I can't remember what it was. It was like, we're not going to get into the broading or painting with a broad brush kind of thing. Uh, how do you think that we can facilitate those kind of things? Because I think that's what's missing, is that people are going to these media sources, they're going to Twitter, they're going to the comment section on YouTube or the comment section on Instagram, and they think that's having a discussion. And really, I think when you take the human away from being face to face with you, I mean, I know we're not actually in the same room right now, but it is different when it's like this than it is if we were on Twitter and it's not live, because we all know that every comment that comes back and is like, well, actually, blah, blah, blah. It's like that person Googled that thing right before. I mean, I'm guilty of this too, where I'm like, I want to get the facts before I come in with my rebuttal. It's just not the same as having a discussion in a living room with someone. And I think that we're missing that. And I think that's where the best place to get pushback is like a friend. I think someone that you know and trust going, actually, that thing that you're saying didn't happen, or that's not really the whole story, or have you thought about this angle? I think that it's foolish to think that we're going to be convinced, like, it's foolish to think that Fox News viewers are going to be convinced by anything that's said on MSNBC and vice versa, and or like rabid Trump supporters are going to be ever convinced by anything anyone on the left says, and vice versa. If you're a rabid Biden supporter or a rabid Democrat, that you're going to be convinced by the argument by the other side. And so that's where I feel like we got to have more inter party or intra party, how would you say that, whatever, like that we'd say, hey, I'm going to call out the people on my side. Do you see, I mean, there's no reward for that right now. Though is the problem, is that those people are getting kicked out of the party or they're losing their seats in Congress. So that's where I go back to, if people don't demand it, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like I know I want to like do that rally. I want to do like the rally where we champion the people that call us out, call the people on our own side out,
Yeah.
right? Somehow make that like some kind of give that more social juice than it gets today. Because like you say, today, I was saying earlier, like there's not like it's hard to question yourself, but also there's like a big penalty for it. Like if I start questioning things people in my quote unquote tribe say, I'm going to get ostracized or whatever. But I think to your thing about social media, I want to say there that it's bad in so many ways, right?
Yeah.
It's the worst possible way to have these conversations for like all the reasons. But a big one is also just that it's a whole misperception world, right? Like a lot of, like you were just saying, a lot of the people that have those opinions that might be contrary to their own tribe have kind of walked away from these conversations because there's no place for me. Like
Yeah.
the title of your show, right? Like you're homeless, right?
Yeah.
That's how a lot of people feel, left and right, and across the spectrum. And I don't even like to use any of these terms at this point,
Yeah, because they
but
almost don't mean anything.
yes,
We're having such a political realignment now too that they don't, right and left. It's like, what does that mean anymore? Because like I feel like I've had the
Right.
same opinions for a long time, but they've just now fallen out of favor with a lot of the right. So I'm like, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm not part of it. I don't know. It's weird.
Well, and most real people, don't necessarily align, with whatever today's quote unquote right is and whatever today's quote unquote left is. Anyway, most of us have stuff we care about, stuff we don't care about as
Yeah.
much, and we're not always in sync with either party. But that's not the message people hear. People, see the MTGs and the Ocasio Cortezes and the Elizabeth Warrens. They see these people that are out there, saying there's no, we don't have no tolerance for anything that doesn't align 100%, and they think that's the norm, and they kind of think that's the caricature for anybody they're going to run into that maybe has a different opinion than them. Then they must also align with all that stuff. And the reality is that's not true. Like most, it's clearly a majority of people that do not align with that, but somehow they really dominate the environment, with the media environment we see, both online and in other media forms as well, and even at the political elite place, right? I mean, Elizabeth Warren is going to tell you she agrees with every single thing that's in the left agenda, even though really these two things don't even seem to have the same values around them. But you agree with those, okay? All right, fine. But it's that kind of thing, right? So that's this misperception that we have, and when we are able to get face to face with somebody we know, which it does help to have trust, like and you find out, wow, this person believes this thing, but they also, like, we agree on a bunch of other stuff, or at least they have kids and they seem like normal people. They're not the caricatures we were told that they should look like, or they don't look like the crazy person on social media,
Yeah.
and it starts to, like, your brain has to glitch a little bit, and that's really good for us, right? We
Yeah.
need that, right? You need some way to create that glitch that makes us look at the world and go, oh, okay, it doesn't necessarily fit this kind of model we've been told. And like you were saying before, the fact that we kind of don't have these conversations, and oh, you're not allowed to talk about politics, as you say, it means we just don't have any practice for it. We don't have any, and we don't have the skills there. And I will say that there are skills involved in it too, and that it does require intention, because it's not necessarily, if you let your sort of dinosaur brain, or kind of run the conversation, it's not going to go well, right? So you really have to be very active to sort of be a listener, and also not to assume. A lot of the social media fights are the really bad ones, because it really is about winning and losing. Like, no
Right.
one even cares about, at the
Yeah.
point no one even cares about the issue anymore.
Right.
It's just like, I won the argument,
Yeah.
like, I'm great, look at me. And that's just not a good way to enter into a conversation, right? No one's going to win this argument. We should, a great way, that a metaphor that I like to use is, we're on a mission together to go see why we look at this a different way. Like, let's look at this like we're detectives and want to understand why we look at the issue and have come to different conclusions on it, right? Let's go solve that question together. And not I'm not trying to win or lose. I'm not even going to try to change. We're not trying to change each other's mind necessarily. But let's go on this mission to understand why we have a different how we came to a different conclusion on the same facts. And sometimes trying to sort out how we have different facts. I think that's a much better way to, and then that's the only way to approach these kind of conversations that's going to work. And you're very much right that, because we don't have that practice, and because
Yeah.
we do it on social media, the worst possible place to do it, you know, we weren't any good at it, and we can get triggered really really quickly in those conversations, and also because we're in our bubbles, when we do first run into somebody that has a contrary opinion, it's another kind of a glitch. Like, whoa, you believe that weird thing? Like, that's only crazy people believe that thing. And so that can really throw you off too, because and you saw a lot of this. I think we were all stressed out around the pandemic, and even leading up to it. You had the whole Trump years, and you see people, the first time they see somebody with an opinion, you find out they have an opinion that's different than yours, you, like, cancel them, or block
Yeah.
them, or whatever term you want to use, because it's just like, well, then boom, they must be a terrible person because they believe that one thing. And that's it's a little bit hard to get over that, because it can, like I say, it can really kind of glitch your brain a little bit, really disrupt things to step out of your bubble, where you're just used to saying these kind of, like, you don't realize there's sort of like that's a pretty extreme position. Like you don't really realize how that's a pretty extreme position because in your bubble, it's like, oh yeah, cheers to you. You have that crazy, that view. But other people are going to have, going to look at that and go, wow, you're super extreme on that issue. And so we just don't have those conversations very often, and so we find ourselves getting triggered really fast and letting that kind of dinosaur brain take over. And so it requires a lot of intent, and is some training to kind of in practice to sort of have those conversations. And that's where a facilitator or a moderator type role can really help too.
And that's why I think that you mentioned like the bubbles, and those bubbles are getting tighter and tighter. So it's not people tended to, there's income groups that people tend to like group up in, and like your neighborhood obviously is going to be similar, probably socioeconomically and stuff. But we've gone way beyond that. And it's not just that people look like us or that they have about the same amount of income as us, or we live in the same city in the same neighborhood, obviously. But now it's like people are moving out of red states because they can't handle being Democrats in red states, and they can't handle being conservatives in blue states. And it's not even just about policy stuff that they're like, this is my vote that saying this is not working anymore and I'm leaving, because I think that's happening in places. You're seeing, but some of that stuff works itself out. Like the progressive DAs that people have voted in, and now that they are like just not prosecuting any crimes, and they've seen the repercussions of that, they're changing, they're switching back. So like, some of these school board members in San Francisco, which is like super liberal, are like, those people are losing their seats because they go, no, that's too far. You've gone too far. So some of it I feel like is starting to, like, as things affect their real life. I think the problem on the national level is that so much of it doesn't, like you mentioned, actually affect our real life. Like your local school board affects your real life a lot more than the president does, or your local DA not prosecuting crimes affects your real life a lot more, especially if you're like a business owner or something like that. So I think you are starting to see some pushback in like cities and states against like their own side. In a very liberal city, they're pushing back against the most liberal kind of maybe ideas because they didn't work. They might even give them a shot, but then they go, that didn't work. That's the only kind of hope I see, is like that silver lining of, I'm starting to see it happen a little bit at some margins of the really bad policies that either side have. But I think that you have to put a little bit more effort. And by you, this is me talking to all citizens. I feel like have to put a little bit more effort in, like, I'm not saying your best friend has to have the opposite opinion of everything on you. I spent my 20s as a musician. As you can probably guess, almost everyone I know is more liberal than I am in that realm. This just tends to be how it goes. I don't think that's a detriment. I don't think that's I think some people are just scared of that because I don't know why, but like we've just determined that we've got to like be in our own little bubble and never talk to people. And I think part of it is that so much from the top down has said that people that feel this way are evil or they have bad intentions. And I think that's the main thing that would be helped from, that the people can't necessarily control. I do think that has to come from the top down. I think that we need a president or leaders that would say, like Joe Biden should have come. Like if I were Joe Biden, obviously I'm not the president for all sorts of reasons. I wouldn't want that job. You'd have to. That'd be a bad. I wouldn't be good at it. But I think he should have come and said a little bit more forcefully, because you're right. It's turned into what you said earlier in the show, where it's half of the country is not on our team. And Donald Trump does this worse than anyone, but the sort of like, those aren't real Americans. That's sort of the tagline for when you're talking about liberals, specifically on the right, is like, well, they're not real Americans. And you hear the same thing or like pretending that like rural American is more real American than cities on the coast. We're all Americans. They're the same amount of America. And immediately writing off half the country does something psychologically to that other half that I think is not, it's not unfair that that's what it does. Like, I think that that's an appropriate response to someone telling you that you're not a real American because you didn't vote for them. I think that there should be some indignation there. I think that's okay. Like that makes me mad too. But it would be nice if a leader came up and said, you know what? And like, Barack Obama kind of did this at one point. It was like, I know a lot of you didn't vote for me, but that doesn't mean I'm not gonna, like, you're still Americans, and like, you're still my, like, I am, I can't remember the exact words, but essentially I work for you, and I want to build bridges and stuff. And Biden tried to say this in the campaign. I don't feel like he's done a very good job after having been elected and being sworn in of actually trying to do that. I think he's just too captured by his base to be able to do it. But I do feel like we desperately need that. And I just don't see anyone on the horizon that has given any sort of inkling of being able to do that. Are there any politicians or, thought leaders or people that you think are um maybe trying to do that a little bit more, trying to say like, hey, we can have these discussions and we can disagree, but we don't have to assign ill intent to the other side. We can, because everything's racist or uh everything's a conspiracy now, and it's never just that like, hey, that's a bad idea. I don't feel like I ever hear that.
Yeah, I will say that there are Spencer Cox in Utah, um, and a few other folks in I think in sort of his coalition have attempted some of that. I'm sorry I don't remember the exact candidates now who it was, but there was a really cool video that they did together. So it was the Democrat and the Republican, and they did the whole, like, I my candidate I mean my opponent has there's a bunch of here's all these things that I think he's wrong about, but he's a good man, and he's a good American, and and both sides kind of both candidates sort of had that conversation, and they were together in the room, and they sort of shook hands, and they kind of demonstrated some of this behavior that you're talking about, which I wish that was celebrated more,
Yeah.
and really out there. So it's pretty bad that I can't even remember who it is right
Right.
now.
Yeah.
you know? It tells you how much like it wasn't popularized enough. But Spencer Cox is sort of out there, one of those people that's sort of interested in this, like really trying to say like, yeah, the Democrats that I'm, running against have terrible ideas, but they're good people, they're good Americans, this kind of thing, and we can disagree about these ideas without saying they're bad people or they're evil or that kind of stuff. So it's happening a little bit, and but like you said, I mean, we also see the other side of that a lot of people that kind of try to do that and they're not able to. I mean, I think Joe Biden, as you noted, I mean, he's always been sort of a centrist sort of guy, and yet now he's had to take up these positions, and he's echoing a lot of this rhetoric. I think your assessment is correct that it is sort of he's afraid of his own base,
Yeah.
and you certainly see that with a lot of Republicans. I mean, it's easy, the ones for me, the Republicans seem to be a little bit more in the news, but I guarantee you a lot of this is happening with Democrats as well. So I don't want to act like it's completely there, but there's a bunch of that Republicans that have sort of been sort of, I don't know, I'm gonna say trumped out of the out of the party. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They that and you also see people that man, they reverse their position in some. I mean, and that's not new. That's
Yeah,
always
that
happened
always
too. But
happens with
what
politicians, but it does seem more egregious in a time when we have the internet and can look back at the video of you saying the thing that you said yesterday. Sometimes it's
right?
not even 24 hours since you said the opposite thing.
Well, and some of it also the degree, which I mean, I don't remember, the number of people that sort of said, talking about Trump, because Trump is, I kind of, it's always frustrating to talk about him a little bit because he's sort of an anomaly in all this, but at
He
the
is.
same time, he's really there and he's really real, and he could easily be, he might win, he probably will win, maybe he will, I don't know, probably, but it's gonna be close. It's
I,
gonna be close. He's not gonna lose by a landslide. He could be president again, and um, and you see the number of people that say, that he's unfit and he's a security threat and he's a danger to the, and then, but yeah, I'm going to vote for him.
right.
You
Yeah.
know?
And I think that kind of excusing it only happens when you vilify the other side so much and make the other side so threatening that makes sense. There are situations where I heard a podcast the other day where they were going like trying to give the hypothetical. Okay, well, if it's Trump versus Hitler, you know what I mean? Like, are you going to vote for Trump? And like, it's like I think there are reasonable like extremes that we could go to, but the problem is that we're painting people as Hitler when they're not. I think that's really where it
Right.
gets to. It's like, yeah, if we knew this person, but I mean, some people claim that that is what Trump is. I would argue that he's Hitler could have gotten Obamacare repealed. So I don't think that it's exactly. I don't think he's actually has the amount of power that he thinks he does, or that people are scared of him being able to do because our Constitution purposely limits the presidency, and so far it's done pretty well at that. That's why things aren't getting done because we have this system set up like we talked about. But there's these famous examples of people that were like really great friends. I mean, like I think the Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Scalia were like very, very close. Obviously, there's not a lot of overlap in the way that they viewed their jobs or their opinions about how the Constitution works. I mean, they were on far ends of the extremes of that. I just don't feel like most people even know that that was the case. Is that, if that makes sense? Or I think back, like, obviously this is a more of a bias because I'm from Oklahoma, but you know, Tom Coburn, which was our senator, and Barack Obama were freshman senators together, and they became really close, even though they don't line up on almost anything. But they were both like, I remember like Tom Coburn coming out at certain points and being like, this attack on his character is ridiculous. Like, we disagree on almost everything, but I'm not going to attack his character or his intentions. He has good intentions, and Obama had said the same thing about him because they were actually friends. But you just don't. That seems to be retreating as far as people being able to even come out and say that they're like, and defend someone on the other side that is their friend, because it's kind of like this understood thing. They're like, hey, I've got to go TV. I got to go on TV and talk crap about your side. We can be buddies in the gym, but I can't do it on TV. And they're just like being okay with that because they're like, but we got to keep our jobs. I think that's probably a big part of it. But again, this comes down to, we need leaders with backbones, and we need people to demand leaders with backbones, but it's a chicken and egg situation. I don't know how you get
Yeah.
one before the other without someone just like
Right.
putting their foot down.
Yeah, it's definitely that's the chicken and egg problem is definitely I think a big one. You know, a watershed moment on this I think about is that you probably kind of remember the John McCain, like I think it was at one of his rallies, and the lady was talking about Obama as a Muslim and he's
Right.
going to do this and he's going to do that, and McCain said, "Well, no, wait, ma'am, we disagree on these issues, but he's
Took
a
the
good
mic
man."
from her. Yeah, just like said, no, we're not
And
going to talk
and
like
it
that.
was like but it was also like a death blow. Like you can't do that. Like that didn't help him. Like that hurt him with that base, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that cost him, I think, votes, right? And so nobody does that now. Like no one has the, as you say, the courage to do that now because they're afraid of their own base. I think this is true on both sides, as we say. Biden's kind of, I think, kind of showing that he's a little bit afraid of his base. So yeah, I mean that's a shame that we're there, and like you say, that chicken and egg problem is really there, and that's why, like you were saying, some of it's like some of it's got to come from the top. I think it's sort of both directions. I mean, like you say, it's not going to work unless there's also kind of a movement,
Yeah.
and I think that's what we're really talking about is these small, individuals have to turn into movements, right? We have to turn this into a movement that and like my dream is like like some kind of a champion. I talked about one version of this earlier, but I'm kind of this idea of like a bipartisan route, like find an issue where there's something that both sides are really there's a good constituency on both sides that are interested in this, and just have like the biggest bipartisan rally we've ever had, right? I mean, that's my dream. Like make that and get more of that going. That and maybe even on an issue that we disagree with, we can do the same kind of thing where we can say these people, I think these people are wrong, but they're good people. Like they just need to be doing more of that. Because yeah, it's believing the other side is evil, which creates a certainty, and that certainty creates um, basically justifies the outrage,
Uh-huh.
and then it justifies these. It moves that moral bar we were talking about in the beginning, and it essentially sort of dehumanizes people, and that's a bad road. I mean, that road does not end well.
Yeah, especially because I mean, every movie in Hollywood, if the hero has to do something bad for the greater good, we're okay with it. And that's what everyone's mentality is now, is that like, well, that person's evil. It's okay for me to bend the rules, or it's okay for me to lie. It's okay for me to whatever, weaponize the Justice Department. It's okay for me to say I'm gonna be like whatever. Pick the thing. It justifies the action because we do believe that when something truly is, it's like the bombing of Hiroshima would be the good example of like that was a decision that we made or we decided was going to be the better. It would save more lives in the long run. Like we had to end this war. It wasn't going to end any other way. Obviously, do I prefer that we don't have to drop bombs on a country? Of course. Like war sucks. I don't want to have to do that. But there was a degree of something having like that is a justified, I mean, in my opinion, a justified like we got to end this war kind of thing. And that would be an example. But we are using like Hiroshima in these like political examples with local politics or just the parties and stuff. And it is not World War II. It's just not, you cannot take the actions that are justified in a world war and use them in politics. But that's where we've kind of moved everything to. It feels like everything's a war, everything's a battle. And even the language that they use is like that. It's battle language. It's fight. I mean, that's the whole thing about January 6th is that Trump's telling them to go fight. And then you can interpret if that means go break into the Capitol or if that means like call your representative. It leaves it open to interpretation. And I think that it doesn't take convincing very many people. We look at the January 6th stuff. You look at the shooting at the baseball field by the guy that was shooting the congressional baseball team. It doesn't take very many, like, not all there people to go out there and be violent about this kind of stuff. I think that's the thing that would potentially cool things down is like something which obviously don't want to happen. That would be a very bad case scenario that we have to have domestic terrorism of some sort to come to our collective senses. I'm not even sure it would work. I mean, I think that you see plenty of people that are, like I said, I thought January 6th might be the thing. I thought COVID might be the thing. I keep thinking these things are going to be extreme enough that they will wake us up. And I think January 6th did it more than some things. I think that there actually is a significant portion of the electorate that really does not like the January 6th stuff. And my like putting my pundit hat on, I do think that Donald Trump continuously talking about that is the thing that could potentially lose him the election. I would say if I had to bet right now, he's going to win in November. But if he goes out there and just talks about how the January 6th people are hostages, I think there's enough people in the country go like, we actually don't like what happened on January 6th. Even if we're going like, I'd rather not deal with it or talk about why it happened. They don't like that it happened and they don't want to see it happen again. It's embarrassing at the basic level for it to be an American and that be what is shown on the news around the world. But I mean, I do think that, it's like I thought that might be the catalyst to get rid of, and it was for a couple days. And then all those people went back to Trump. It lasted for, I thought, and we keep thinking this. And I think the problem is that it really does all come back to voters in the sense that we have to be the people that demand better. And I just don't see that we're currently doing that. And I unfortunately think that something bad will have to happen for us to do so. But that's depressing, I guess. But it's at least encouraging that on the margins, people like you are having conversations. People like you are putting out content that talks about like why this is a bad thing. And hopefully people like me are hosting good conversations too. And I wish more people did it with their friends and their family and their neighbors. And I think that's the only way. It's like, it's going to take time. That's not going to be something that changes overnight. Maybe that in combination with a good leader that comes out and says some of these things. Like Barack Obama, I feel like had the best chance of being that person. And I just don't feel like it worked out the way that people wanted it to. I think that he even got some flack for the sort of famous example with him was at one point was calling out like fatherlessness in a black community, which you would think our first black president could do. And Al Sharpton caught on the hot mic on whatever channel it was saying he'd like to cut off his balls. I mean, like, because he can't believe he would say that. So it's one of those things where like you get vilified from your own side more so than you do from the other side when you speak out, and say, hey, here's a real problem on our side. And, that bums me out that even someone with as much clout, I mean, I don't know that there's been a politician in my lifetime that had as much kind of momentum behind him as Obama did. I mean, because Clinton was a very popular president, but it was because he was good at politics, I feel like, more so than anything. Whereas like Obama just had this presence to him, and it still didn't save him from being able to criticize his own side. So I don't know.
Right.
So it's like if Obama couldn't do it, who do I see in the future that's doing it? I don't see a lot of bright spots in the sort of younger crowd in Congress currently or in politics.
Yeah, well, it's looking at the optimism side a little bit. I mean, there are a lot of organizations, sort of looking at this, and there's been a lot of, and I think I'm encouraged by, the polling about sort of independent kind of thinkers and independent
Yes.
voters and things like that. And I think that group is going to get a little fed up with the extremes kind of running everything. And I think they're already frustrated and looking for ways to make it better. So I'm kind of counting a lot on that group to sort of somehow, but it's not happening right now. So
As
but there are many organizations that are sort of tapping into this, and they have a following, and they're seeing support. So that's all encouraging. I mean, I think somehow we have to be better at, instead of there being 8,000 individual organizations doing it, like, let's somehow make it 6.
Consolidate it a
That's
little bit, yeah, to make more of a national movement of some sort, yeah.
and that's part of the problem now is that there's a lot of small efforts running around, and somehow we have to turn that into a bigger movement because you do get the sense that the demand for it's out there. I really think it's there. It's just it's not as easy to tap into as the extremes. Like the extremes, it's a simple message. It's cheap. If you're in the media space, it's real cheap. If you want to create a podcast that's mad about something, right?
Uh-huh.
That's a lot easier to find an audience than exploring topics with nuance.
Yep. As we both have learned. David, thanks for coming on. Links in the show notes or the description to his show, Outrage Overload. I highly suggest checking that out, especially if you're listening to this. You probably do like these kind of nuanced conversations and things. And so that's a great resource for some of the real specific methods and things that people do. He talks to a lot of experts about that specific sort of outrage industry. And so I think it's a good resource, and you can check that out too. And hopefully, David, you'll do more of those kind of hosted conversations. I really did enjoy that after your last episode. Thought it was really good, and it's good. I think it's just good to have these kind of conversations, and I'll hope to have you back sometime.
Oh, I'd like that. Yeah, this was a real fun conversation, Blake. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Of course. Thanks again to David for joining me. You can check out his show. It's linked in the notes. I appreciate you joining me for the conversation as well. If you found value in it, I'd love if you rated it wherever you're listening, and please share it with someone. That really helps me a lot too. You can follow me on Instagram and YouTube at The Homeless Conservative. Feel free to reach out with any questions or topic suggestions or disagreements you have. You can also email me at Blake at The Homeless Conservative. That's it for me. I will catch you next time.